You know, when you're debating the moral argument with people, when they say without God there could be no morality, and sometimes an atheist says, well, how dare you say that I can't be moral without God? And they say, I'm not saying you can't be moral without God, I'm just saying you can't ground your morality.
Yeah.
And yet, on the other hand, they say, but we need you to believe in God, otherwise society falls apart. Maybe you are actually saying that people can't be moral without God, more than just their ability to ground it, if you're saying that without this religious belief, society will fall apart.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but I recognize that some people may think that. I mean, I think that to ground your morality certainly in the Bible would be an appalling thing to do. If you actually look at the Bible, if you look at almost any of the moral lessons you can take from it. And some of the things Jesus said are very nice, but you have to pick and choose your way through. And setting aside Jesus's emphasis on loving your neighbor, which is very nice. The Sermon on the Mount is very nice. The fundamental doctrine of the Old Testament, of course, is appalling. But even
putting the Old Testament aside, in the New Testament,
even the New Testament, the idea that we're born in sin is a hideous idea. The idea that the only way to be saved from sin and the wages of sin is Jesus' death is a hideous idea. And I don't think it's one that Jesus himself ever put forward, is it? I think he probably would be rather shocked at that thought.
Well, I imagine that Jesus would have to be aware of himself as the salvation. And if that's the case, he'll need to be aware of what he's saving people from, which can only be something like slavery to sin. Now,
I wonder whether you're reading something in there. I mean, salvation, he said things like, if you have seen me, you've seen the Father. He said that kind of thing. But did he actually say that he was salvation?
Well, I suppose I am the way, the truth, and the life.
Yeah, but
no one comes unto the Father except through me.
A guide for a good life, something like that. It doesn't mean that he surely never said that my death is necessary in order for you to be saved from sin.
Quite possibly. I think about the idea of the Eucharist and the Last Supper and literally breaking up my body for you. It does seem to be some indication that Jesus knew what he was doing if the Christians are correct about his mission on earth. A moment ago, you said it's an appalling idea that we're all born in sin. And I understand this intuition, but do you not think there's some wisdom in this idea or some sort of necessary humility in recognizing that we all do seem to fall short of the standards that we set for ourselves? That is, we're not going to make sense of a concept like sin because we don't believe in God. We're atheists. Sin doesn't make sense. But even just in terms of our own moral standards, whatever standards we set for ourselves, we seem to fall short of these every single day. And is it not just that idea that's being captured when somebody says, look, even by your own standards, you're falling short of where you should be? And maybe that's what...
Even a newborn baby
we should
born
take it
in
to
sin?
mean. Well, I would probably respond by saying that not all Christians will say that a newborn baby is born in sin in the sense that they're responsible for it. More like born with a propensity towards sinning, which I imagine you would even agree with, that newborn babies, although they haven't, committed immoral acts yet, they're born with this sort of human nature which has a predisposition towards doing things that fall short of our moral standards. Maybe.
I'm sorry for you having to do a degree in this kind of thing. It's not a real subject, is it?
We talked about this before on our previous podcast, and I think it's something that you wanted to ask me about today, isn't it? I mean,
yes. It's obviously something that still interests you.
Certainly.
Talking about sin and things like that. I cannot imagine spending 3 years. How did you stand it?
I'll answer it in two ways. The first is to say that the theology faculty was actually theology and religion. So I was able to study religion as anthropology, religion as history. You can do papers in science and religion, this kind of stuff. And I imagine you'd be very interested in that kind of thing. Theology itself I found useful for a few reasons. One of them, of course, there's like a crude sense in which by studying theology, it helps me to debate it. It helps me to argue with people.
I get that, definitely.
But it's also an interesting window into human psychology. For example, clearly the question does interest you. Why is it that people can can believe so strongly and so easily in this idea that everybody's born in sin.
Yes,
isn't that
interesting.
evil? Isn't that horrible?
That's a psychological question. And if you, I don't know what sort of essays you had to write, but if you were allowed to write an essay on that, that would have been interesting. If you were allowed to ask a question, how can anyone believe this stuff? But I imagine you had to actually write a serious essay on the concept of sin itself and the idea of redemption and the idea of atonement.
Well, suppose you wanted to write that essay, which you just said was an interesting question. Why would anybody believe this? Well, in order to answer that, you have to get to grips with the reasons people have for believing it.
Yes.
And I suppose that's what I'm doing here with you in saying, because you bring up the point when you look at the New Testament, you bring up this exegesis, this interpretation. This is an evil text because it tells people that they're born in sin. And I suppose the question implicitly in what you're saying there is, how can you believe this? And I'm doing that devil's advocate thing again of trying to, I suppose, explain why it is that somebody might believe this and say that even an atheist might recognize that there's a sense in which that's at least poetically true. We're all born in a state where we are unable to fulfill the standard that we want to fulfill. You know what I mean?
Poetically, yes. I suppose you could see it at a poetic level. Interestingly, I don't know whether I've told you this before, but when The Selfish Gene was published, both the chaplains of my college came up to me and said they'd read it and they thought it had echoes of Original Sin, and it was a poetic resonance with Original Sin, and I suppose that's quite interesting.
Why would The Selfish Gene have a resonance with Original Sin?
Well, they were thinking of it in terms of the selfish gene having a sort of primitive rationale for selfishness. So that's not what the book was really intended to be about, but that's how they interpreted it. And so that resonated with their idea of Original Sin.
And what do you make of the criticism in the opposite direction? Somebody says, I've spent my life studying Thomistic metaphysics. I'm a classical theologian. I've got a PhD, and I looked in The God Delusion, and I wanted to see what Richard Dawkins had to say about Thomas Aquinas's 5 proofs of the existence, his 5 ways to establish the existence of God. And they find 2 pages, and this